Howdy my totally as always tubular gamers, and we're back with, you guessed it, another ranking video. Now today's is going to be the first of three actually. Today we're going to be looking at all of the classic Need for Speed games. Now Need for Speed, do I really need to explain to you what Need for Speed is? It's probably the most popular racing game franchise of all time outside of Mario Kart. When you think of driving video game series, Need for Speed is probably one of the first ones that you usually think of with Forza, Mario Kart, and maybe Gran Turismo. It's one of the longest running driving series of all time, starting in the early 90s and going all the way to modern day, with a new game just getting announced recently. And you know, I love driving games, and so I thought, hey, I would like to rank all the Need for Speed games. That sounds like a really good ranking. And so I went, how many games could there really be? I've played some of them, and I look it up and went, oh shit, there's like 25 Need for Speed games, not even including the handheld titles. And so my mission was simple. I was going to sit down and play through all of the home console Need for Speed games. And as I was playing through them, I still haven't finished them actually up to this point, I realized that there's a couple different eras of Need for Speed. There's kind of three eras, I'd say. There's the classic era of Need for Speed, there's the 2000s of Need for Speed, and then there's modern Need for Speed, and all three of these are vastly different from each other. They're all vastly different when it comes to their developer, quality, presentation, aesthetic, handling, really everything. Like, some of these games you wouldn't even know are part of the Need for Speed series. I would say that Need for Speed is probably the most diverse racing game series of them all. They didn't really just stick to a formula. Need for Speed has changed so much throughout the years. And while they have had a number of throwbacks, really the only thing connecting all of these games is that they're all published by EA and they're all driving games. And so for today's video, I thought I would look at the first era of Need for Speed, an era of Need for Speed games I've actually finished. That's what I said at the beginning of the video. We're going to be looking at all the classic Need for Speed games. So I'm going to be looking at all the Need for Speed games from the 90s, back when the series was still getting its footing, when they had lots of exotic cars, and really a lot of these games are very different from each other. The only thing connecting them really is the Need for Speed name. And you'll quickly find out a few of these games weren't even originally Need for Speed games. They just got the title. So we're going to be looking at all the PS1 versions of these games. I know the PC version is sometimes superior to the PS1 version, but hey, I have them all on my classics, so that's the version I played. We're going to be ranking them based off, you know, the usuals, pretty much everything. How do they handle? How do they hold up? Is there a lot of content? Are they still fun? All that good stuff. As always, typical YouTube crap, like, share, subscribe. Let me know your favorite Need for Speed from the 90s down below, or just your favorite Need for Speed in general. So let's get into it. What do I think is the worst classic Need for Speed game? I think it's Need for Speed V-Rally, released in '97. Now, Need for Speed V-Rally is interesting because outside of North America, this game is just titled V-Rally and published by Infogrames, but in the US, it's Need for Speed V-Rally and published by EA. They struck a deal to give it the Need for Speed name, but you can really tell that this is not really a Need for Speed game, especially when comparing it to the other games on this list. It really feels nothing like a Need for Speed game. It's actually a rally racing game. Now, I'll be real, I've been trying to get into rally racing games more, but outside of Dirt, I just can never really get too into them, this game included. I just wasn't really a big fan of this game. And I actually think that this game is aged pretty poor, especially compared to the other games on this list. The biggest area where the game is aged is the frame rate and the graphics. Of course, the graphics are going to age. It's an old game, but graphics are really important in a rally racing game. See, examining the terrain and observing it and trying to appropriately drive through the terrain is a part of the entire appeal of rally racing. If you drive in a ditch at the wrong angle and the car spins out, your entire run is screwed. And so when the graphics are as poor as this is, and it's really hard to distinguish the terrain, it often leads me to, again, going in ditches the wrong way or going off jumps the wrong way and just kind of spinning out of control because I wasn't really sure what I was even looking at. The graphics don't even have to be good for me to be able to distinguish it. They just need to be distinguishable, and I just don't think that this game does an accurate job, and it leads to a lot of frustration where I go, what do you mean there was a ditch there? What do you mean I went off that bump wrong and I just couldn't really tell? I was just kind of winging it. What doesn't help is the game's controls and physics, which are very inconsistent and just incredibly twitchy. Most of the game's difficulty really comes from the controls. Like, this is super precise and, again, twitchy. You will just tap the D-pad left and your car will turn a bunch to the left. Like, it is way too much. I just don't really like the handling in this game, and the physics are, like I said, inconsistent. Sometimes you turn hella, sometimes you don't really turn hella, sometimes you go off a jump and you're fine, sometimes you're not. And this game really just has a steep learning curve thanks to the controls. I didn't think the courses or AI were all that difficult. It really was the controls. By the time I was done with the game and got to the end, yes, I had gotten to grips with the controls and gotten pretty decent, but all that time in between, it really just wasn't all that fun. I know that rally games usually have a learning curve, but I just thought this was too steep and really just generally kind of frustrating. And the lack of music didn't help things, and with all this in mind, I just don't really recommend V-Rally. I don't think it's worth trying even if you like rally games. Go try a different one. And so here we have Need for Speed 2, originally releasing in '97, the best year ever. Now, Need for Speed 2 really took a drastic change from the original Need for Speed. A lot of people complain that the original Need for Speed just didn't feel all that fast. It didn't have a great sense of speed. And so, well, EA took a very different approach with Need for Speed 2. That was the main focus. That was the priority, is to make this game feel and go as fast as possible. And you'll immediately see that from the moment you start Need for Speed 2 up, you start going crazy fast. Speeds that you've never gone in any of the series. We're talking nearly 400 miles an hour. I am not joking. You really do go that fast. This game has an arcade and simulation style of driving, but to be honest with you, these don't really mean all that much. I mean, either way, you're still going just as fast, and it slightly alters the handling. Really, when it comes to the handling and just driving or controls in general, it just isn't all that great. It really does feel just kind of out of control most of the time. I mean, I don't even know how you'd make it feel in control when you're going this fast. This game, if you couldn't tell, is a lot more unrealistic than the first game. It's a lot faster, it plays a lot faster, and you go on much longer tracks since you're going so fast. Unfortunately, the cars don't really feel all that different from each other. One of the best aspects of the first game, they just kind of all feel like rocket ships. No matter what car you pick, they just kind of all blast off and all have terrible turning. I'd really say my biggest issue with the game is the physics and general controls. I just don't think they're very good. So this game has a couple different modes to it. You can do the usual race, and there's a time trial and even a tournament mode, but this game does introduce the knockout mode where last place gets eliminated every lap, which would be a staple for the Need for Speed series. And you know, I think this is all well enough, and most of the tracks are pretty good in this game. I'd say a majority of them are decent to good. The ones with a ton of turns, though, good luck not crashing into all the walls. Unfortunately, the presentation isn't so hot here either. This game has a ton of pop-in, way more than the first game. I mean, how could it not? You're going so fast and so much is going by you. The same thing goes for the frame rate. It's just not very good, and it gets really choppy. But at least the music is fantastic. Like, wow, I was just kind of blown away with how good the music was. I'm still listening to it now. It is just really great. Now, Need for Speed 2, I would not say is aged very well. I think the first game is aged better, and I just don't really think it's that good of a game. This game has absolutely no real grip on reality, and I'm not saying it has to, but whatever this game goes for, I just don't think it works. And man, those controls are sloppy. I just don't really think anybody should try this game. And so here we have the original Need for Speed, developed and published by Electronic Arts and originally put out on the 3DO in 1994. I played the PlayStation version that was released in '96. Now, the original Need for Speed is very interesting to come back to. Now, despite being decently different from the later games, this game really did establish the blueprint that the series would go on to follow in pretty much every entry. Coming back all these years later to play the original Need for Speed, I'll be real, it's not actually that difficult to come back to once you get past the presentation. Yes, the game doesn't look amazing, but the frame rate was generally pretty solid and there wasn't a ton of poppin'. It was fine for the time. This game doesn't have a huge car roster either. There's not a ton of cars to this game, but what they did instead was they went out of their way to make every single car feel incredibly different from the others, with a different feeling, different handling, and different engine roars. Each car has a bunch of history to it as well. It's clear whoever made this game really did care about the cars and really was a big fan. And when it comes to the courses, it's a similar story. There's not a ton of them, but they are all very different from each other. They all have a decent amount of detail, and again, they're all different to drive on. Some of them have really tight turns, and some of the courses just really are straightaways that let you go as fast as possible. And you can actually race during different times of the day, which is pretty cool. Now, when it comes to this game's handling and controls and collision detection, it can be a little iffy and a bit wonky. The physics and general controls are pretty freaking tight in this game. Like, they're a bit stiff. You really gotta turn. Really, it's the opposite problem of V-Rally where it's not sensitive enough, but you really will want to slow down to make some of these tight turns. You actually have to shift into drive at the start of every race, which I thought was funny the first time I played. I was like, why am I not going? But it's a nice touch. And while I don't think the driving is the easiest to get into, I don't think this game is a steep learning curve, and I think with some basic patience, you'll be more than fine and you'll get pretty good at this game pretty fast. The game has a tournament mode, it has a single race mode, and a time trial. You can even do one-on-ones, and there's police and other cars here that you're dodging, and I think this is pretty cool. And all this had not really been seen all that much in racing games. The music in this game is pretty awesome too. I thought it was just really good stuff. So yes, the original Need for Speed, it's dated, it's aged, it's a bit limited, but I still think that the game is pretty fun, and despite all of that, I still did have a good time with it, and I still think it's actually worth trying, especially if you want to see the original Need for Speed and the roots of the series. Yeah, it's worth trying. It's actually a decent game. So here we have another interesting game. We have Need for Speed V-Rally 2. So get this, it was developed by Eden Studios, and when it was published in 1999 for the PlayStation, it was known as Need for Speed V-Rally 2. However, when it was released on the Dreamcast in 2000, it was known as Test Drive V-Rally. So I guess if I ever rank the Test Drive games, this game will be here too. So V-Rally 2 really looks at that original game and really does try to improve on it in a number of different ways, and I actually think that this game is quite a substantial improvement from that original game. This game really does improve my two biggest issues with that original game. First off, the presentation is actually really good in this game. It's really easy to distinguish terrain and bumps and jumps and ditches and everything that you need to distinguish. Like, it is just a vast improvement over the original game, and it does actually look pretty good for a PS1 game. The Dreamcast version looks even better. The frame rate was solid throughout, and I really like the attention to detail on the cars. The game's controls are so much better. It is nowhere near as twitchy or slippery or all over the place like that original game. It is a lot more tight. It still can feel a little slippery at times, but for the most part I thought it was pretty good, and I was able to get to grips with it much faster than the original game. Now, it seemed at times that the original game was almost going for a kind of sim-like approach with arcade flair. This game just drops anything related to sim. It is a much more arcade approach. You go a lot faster, and I think it works towards the game's favor. It handles well enough, but it's nowhere near perfect. I feel like these cars don't have a ton of weight. I mean, not only when you're turning and in the physics, but I mean just literally they don't have a ton of weight, and it causes you to flip and roll way too often in this game, like to the point that it's just comical. And that can lead naturally to some frustration. At least it feels really good to drift in this game. In the original game, it didn't ever feel like you were drifting at all. Here it actually does feel like you're drifting, and it does feel really nice. And I think for the most part the courses are pretty decent, everything's pretty solid, and I really didn't have any issues with any of the courses in this game. Something I did have an issue with is the AI. The AI in this game is incredibly inconsistent to the point where I was just like, what is going on? Sometimes you will just absolutely smoke them, you will destroy them, they were not even close. And then other times it's reversed, where you just can't even come close to beating them. And I've noticed that sometimes the AI is just kind of messed up. I don't really know how else to say it. Like, they will crash on the same spot every lap. Like, they just don't know how to get past a certain part. And while that is funny, at the same time, it's like, man, what's wrong with the AI? I guess they just didn't playtest the AI enough, or I don't know what went on there. I think V-Rally 2 is a pretty decent racer. Again, I don't really like rally games outside of Dirt, but this is one I actually had some fun with. I can actually say that if you like rally games, this might be worth trying out. Oh yeah, and the game is music, it's pretty decent, but still, game's worth checking out. And so here we have Need for Speed High Stakes, released originally in '99 on the PlayStation. High Stakes really tries to look at Hot Pursuit, and they try to attempt to mix up the formula a little, improve on things, and it really does, as the title implies, raise the stakes. Now, if you played Hot Pursuit, this game will feel very familiar with you immediately. When it comes to the handling and general physics of the game, it is pretty much the same as Hot Pursuit, which I think is actually pretty good. But something that High Stakes does is the game features more realistic elements than Hot Pursuit. It introduces a damage system that allows cars to actually take real damage when colliding with objects, and it will actually affect their appearance and performance, which had not really been seen in the series. Now, I kind of get why they added this to the game. It adds another wrinkle to the driving and maybe a little bit more strategy, but I just don't really like it all that much. It really de-incentivizes you driving like a madman or smashing into the other opponents. Maybe I was just playing these games wrong the whole time, but I really liked always doing that, and with all this in mind, now it's like, okay, well now my car might actually get so messed up that I lose the race, and I just don't think it makes it as fun. I will say though, I do like seeing the damage on the car. That is a nice touch, but maybe I'm in the minority here. I don't like that my performance is affected by crashing. This game also introduces a series of economy-based tournaments where they would award players with a cash prize that can be spent on repairing your car, purchasing new cars, upgrading cars, and all that fun stuff. It's kind of almost like a strategic element at times. On top of that, the game is all the usual Need for Speed modes with the single race, the tournament, the knockout, and of course the hot pursuit returns, and it's just as good as it was in the last one, in addition to, like I mentioned earlier, the high stakes mode. I think that this game has a decent amount of replayability, and it actually has a lot going on. I think the courses are pretty solid, there's a lot of variance for these, and the car selection is relatively good here. And when it comes to the presentation, I think it was pretty solid. It looks basically the same as Hot Pursuit, fine enough pop in, not a bad frame rate, and the music's pretty good in this game also. Now, while I do like high stakes and I do recommend it, if you're going to try this game, I really think you should try the PC version, as it does not only look a lot better and controls differently, but it has a whole other mode to it, and it just has a little bit more going on. The PlayStation version though is still fine enough. But if you like that classic arcade Need for Speed experience, I think this game is totally worth playing, especially if you like Hot Pursuit. But speaking of Hot Pursuit, here we have what I believe is the best classic 90s Need for Speed game, Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit, developed and published by EA in 1998 for the PS1. Hot Pursuit and High Stakes, I really have neck and neck, but on this day, I'm choosing Hot Pursuit to be the better game. And before we get into it, I want to say, like High Stakes, the PS1 version is a bit behind the PC version in terms of graphics, controls, and some content. But I still think the PS1 version is pretty fun. The controls in this game are actually a really nice blend of Need for Speed 1 and 2. It's not too crazy, it's got a good sense of speed, the cars have weight. I really do think that the physics are actually pretty nice in this game. You don't ever feel like you're totally out of control. It doesn't feel like you're ever going a stupid amount of speed like the second game, but you still do have a sense of speed, much better than the first game, and it doesn't ever really feel sluggish either. I think the controls are, again, nice blend and are pretty good. Something I think the second game totally failed at that this game excels at is really trying to make all the cars feel different again. All of them do feel different, they have different noises, they handle differently, and you're operating some pretty cool pieces of machinery here. All these exotic cool cars, I want them to feel different from each other, and I think that this game really gets that feeling down, much better than the second game. And I think that the car selection is pretty good, especially for the time. And speaking of feeling different, we have all the tracks. I think all the tracks feel pretty different from each other. There's a good amount of variety here. There's weather effects, and there's even mirrored versions of all of these tracks. I think that this is some of the best in the series. So while this game does have the standard single race, time trial, championship, and knockout, something that Hot Pursuit added was, as the title implies, the Hot Pursuit. The hot pursuit of the police going after you. Yeah, where the police are trying to take you out for going too fast. Where you'll be in the middle of a race and all of a sudden all these police cars show up and they start laying traps and they're trying to take you out, and you just got to keep trying to race and get away from the police. I think that this is very obviously one of the best additions Need for Speed ever added. I mean, so many of the later Need for Speed games really build on this formula and really have it here because it works. It's a formula that works. It's fun. It's engaging. It keeps things interesting. It adds another layer, another dynamic to the race, and I think it's just great. I would argue it's maybe the best addition the series ever had. I mean, it's seriously that good, and it really changes up the races a lot, and it makes for a really fun, engaging time. I just had a total blast playing this game. On top of that, I thought the presentation was pretty solid. It's not going to blow your mind or anything. The frame rate can be a little suspicious, and there is some pop in here and there, but it was fine for the most part. I think the controls were good, the cars were good, the police chases were great, the tracks were fun, the music is pretty great in this game. This game just kind of has everything going for it, and it is a really good time. I think a lot of people really fondly look back at the original Hot Pursuit and say that's when the series became great, and you know, I kind of agree. I think this is when the series really became great. Out of all the games that I've talked about that are in the classic era of Need for Speed, I think this is the one worth playing the most. And really, it goes to show that it doesn't matter how old the game is, you can still have a bunch of fun with it, even nowadays. I think the game has aged pretty well. I think it has a decent amount of content to it, and like I said, it's just a really fun time. You have a really good sense of speed, and you just go, and it's just a good, fun racing game, and that's all you need sometimes. So that's it for this video. I hope everyone enjoyed me talking about the old Need for Speed games. I don't know when I'll get to the next part of this list, part 2, where I'm going to look at all the Need for Speed games in the 2000s, where they really changed up a lot, and we went from good Need for Speed games to great in the 2000s, and so I can't wait to talk about those games soon enough. Though, if you like this video, share, let me know what your favorite game is. See you later. Bye bye.